The landing gear ripped away at 1,240 feet. The captain collapsed with a heart attack. And the only person who could help was a 17-year-old student pilot with just 68 hours of training, who had never flown anything larger than a 4-seat trainer. 341 lives hung in the balance as Emma Rodriguez faced an impossible choice: stay silent in her seat, or walk into a cockpit where she had no business being. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The departure board at Boston Logan International Airport's Terminal E flickered with the usual morning chaos: delayed flights to Dublin, on-time departures to Paris, the steady rhythm of transatlantic aviation that connects continents every day. Gate B-22 displayed the routine information that 341 people would glance at without really seeing: Transatlantic Airways Flight 2847, Boeing 767-300ER, service to London Heathrow, scheduled departure 7:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, arrival 7 p.m. local time. Just another Tuesday morning crossing, one of thousands that would trace paths across the Atlantic that day. Captain Michael Harrison sat in the left seat of the 767's cockpit, methodically working through the pre-flight checklist with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this exact routine 11,847 times over 31 years. At 58, his gray hair and reading glasses gave him the reassuring appearance passengers expected from their captain: experienced, unflappable, the kind of pilot who'd seen everything and remained calm through all of it. Beside him, First Officer Jennifer Martinez completed her portion of the checklist, her 8 years of airline experience making her movements precise and confident. They were a good crew, professionals who'd flown together enough times to develop the easy rhythm that makes cockpit operations smooth. Pre-flight complete, Martinez reported, her eyes scanning the primary flight display. All systems normal. Fuel load 167,380 pounds, flight plan filed and accepted. Weather at Heathrow looking good, few clouds at 2,500, visibility 10 miles. Harrison nodded, keying his radio. Ground, Transatlantic 2847, Gate B-22, ready for pushback clearance. Behind them, beyond the reinforced cockpit door installed after September 11 changed aviation forever, the twin-aisle cabin of the Boeing 767-300ER filled with the familiar choreography of boarding. Flight attendants greeted passengers with practiced smiles, helping families stow overhead luggage, directing business travelers to their seats, performing the thousand small tasks that make commercial aviation function. Sarah Chen, the senior flight attendant with 16 years at Transatlantic, mentally noted the passenger manifest as people flowed past: 319 passengers total, ranging from a 6-month-old infant in 12D to an 84-year-old woman in 4A, plus the 22 crew members who would care for them during the 6-hour 45-minute crossing. In seat 27F, window side on the right side of the aircraft, 17-year-old Emma Rodriguez adjusted her worn Skyhawk Flight Academy jacket and tucked her backpack under the seat in front of her. The jacket's patches told the story of her aviation obsession: first solo flight, ground school completion, radio communication certification, each small achievement representing countless hours of study and training at the small airport near her home in Newton, Massachusetts. Her dog-eared copy of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge sat on her lap, open to the chapter on flight instruments that she'd been reviewing during the taxi from the parking structure. Interested in flying? The flight attendant's voice was friendly as she leaned down, noticing the aviation jacket while distributing pre-departure orange juice. Emma's face lit up with the enthusiasm only a 17-year-old pursuing her passion could muster. Yes, ma'am. I'm working on my private pilot certificate. I have 68 hours logged so far. I've soloed in both the Cessna 172 and Piper Cherokee. Hoping to get my license next spring. That's wonderful. The attendant's smile was genuine. We always need more pilots, especially young women. Keep at it. The businessman in 27E, mid-40s, expensive suit, already working on his laptop, glanced up briefly and nodded politely before returning to his spreadsheets. The young mother in 27D, wrestling with a squirming toddler, looked relieved that the teenager next to her seemed quiet and well-behaved rather than the stereotype of disruptive youth. Emma was just another passenger among 341 souls, unremarkable except for her aviation jacket, nobody suspecting that this high school senior carrying barely adequate training would soon face a crisis that would test every hour of that experience. Emma had texted her parents from the gate 15 minutes earlier, boarding now. Aircraft looks great, 767 to 300. I'll text when we land. Love you both. The message a 17-year-old traveling alone sends to reassure worried parents. Her father had dropped her at Logan at 5:30 a.m., reminding her 3 times to text when she arrived at Heathrow. Her mother had hugged her too long, worried about her daughter flying internationally alone despite Emma's protests that 17 was plenty old enough. This trip to visit her grandmother in London was a reward for maintaining straight A's while juggling school, flight training on weekends, and the part-time job at the Aviation Museum that helped pay for lessons. She'd posted a photo of the aircraft from the gate to her Instagram 40 minutes ago, the massive Boeing 767 gleaming in the early morning light, caption reading, "One day I'll be flying these instead of sitting in the back." Airplane, already collecting likes from her classmates who thought her pilot dreams were cool in an abstract way but couldn't really understand the obsession that made her spend every Saturday at the airport, practicing touch-and-goes until her arms ached from controlling the yoke. Throughout the cabin, 341 people settled into their routines. Business travelers opened laptops, already working before takeoff. Families organized snacks and entertainment for children. Students heading to study abroad programs chatted nervously about their upcoming adventures. A honeymooning couple in 19A and 19B held hands, beginning their European adventure. Retired teachers in 31C and 31D planned their London itinerary. The fabric of humanity that commercial aviation carries daily, people with plans, dreams, families waiting for them, lives that would continue normally because they trusted the expertise of the crew and the safety of modern aviation. Sarah Chen and her flight attendants performed the safety demonstration that passengers ignored or barely watched, pointing out exits, demonstrating oxygen masks, explaining flotation devices with the knowledge that the 767-300ER could glide for nearly 100 miles if both engines failed over the Atlantic. The routine was so familiar, so mundane, that nobody really considered the emergencies being described. Commercial aviation's safety record had made flying feel boringly safe, the statistics showing you were more likely to die driving to the airport than flying across the ocean. At exactly 7:15 a.m., Transatlantic Flight 2847 pushed back from Gate B-22. Captain Harrison's voice came over the intercom with the standard greeting, welcoming passengers, announcing flight time, noting weather conditions, his tone professionally warm, giving no hint of the catastrophic failure that would strike his aircraft 16 minutes later. Emma listened with the attention student pilots give to airline operations, mentally comparing the captain's procedures to what she'd learned in ground school, imagining herself someday sitting in that left seat commanding a wide-body jet instead of practicing in beat-up trainers. The 767 taxied toward runway 27, Logan's primary departure runway pointing west-southwest. Harrison and Martinez communicated with ground control using the precise phraseology Emma had practiced hundreds of times: ground, Transatlantic 2847, taxi runway 27, each transmission following protocols developed over decades to ensure clarity. Emma watched through her window as the aircraft moved through the complex geography of Logan's taxiways, the airport built partially on filled land extending into Boston Harbor, runways and terminals squeezed into limited space by geography and the nearby city. Passengers barely noticed the taxi. The businessman in 27E typed emails. The mother in 27D negotiated with her toddler about keeping the seatbelt fastened. A teenager across the aisle had earbuds in, already dozing. The mundane normalcy of commercial flight, 341 people trusting their lives to systems and procedures they didn't understand, confident that modern aviation's remarkable safety record would protect them just as it protected the billions of passengers who flew annually without incident. At 7:31 a.m., Transatlantic Flight 2847 lined up on runway 27. Martinez advanced the throttles, the two Pratt & Whitney PW4000 turbofan engines spooling up to takeoff power, each producing 63,300 pounds of thrust, the sound reaching Emma through the cabin insulation as a deep rumble that made her smile with the excitement flying always generated. The 767 accelerated down the runway's 10,081 feet of concrete, pressing passengers back in their seats with the familiar sensation of takeoff acceleration. V1, Martinez called out at 152 knots, the speed beyond which takeoff could not be safely aborted. Rotate, Harrison responded at 162 knots, pulling back on the yoke to lift the nose. The Boeing 767-300ER, weighing 387,000 pounds fully loaded with fuel, passengers, cargo, and crew, lifted smoothly from runway 27 at 7:31 and 14 seconds a.m., beginning its climb over Boston Harbor toward the Atlantic Ocean and a 6-hour 45-minute crossing to London Heathrow. Emma pressed her face to the window, watching the city fall away below, the harbor, the islands, the neighborhoods of East Boston passing underneath as they climbed. She mentally reviewed takeoff procedures, silently critiquing the professionals up front with the confidence of a student who's memorized the textbook but hasn't faced real complexity. The aircraft climbed through 800 feet. Then 1,000 feet. Then 1,200 feet. 43 seconds after liftoff, climbing through 1,240 feet above mean sea level at 187 knots indicated airspeed, disaster struck with violence that shattered the mundane routine. Emma saw it happen because she was looking out the window at exactly the wrong, or exactly the right, moment. The entire main landing gear assembly, the massive wheel and strut mechanism that weighed over 2,800 pounds and allowed the Boeing 767 to land safely, suddenly and catastrophically separated from the fuselage. Not a failure of deployment systems, not hydraulic problems with retraction, but actual structural detachment, the entire assembly simply tore away from its mounting points, ripping free of the aircraft in a spray of metal fragments, hydraulic fluid, and structural components that tumbled away toward the densely populated neighborhoods of East Boston below. Emma's brain refused to process what her eyes showed her. Landing gear didn't just fall off. Aircraft didn't shed critical components during normal operations. This was impossible, couldn't be happening, violated every assumption of aviation safety that made commercial flight the safest form of transportation ever developed. But her window showed undeniable reality. The wheels and struts that should have been retracting into the fuselage were instead falling away, tumbling end over end, getting smaller as they dropped toward houses and schools and streets where people lived normal lives unaware that 2,800 pounds of aircraft debris was plummeting toward them. Oh my God, the wheels just fell off. The businessman in 27E was screaming, his laptop forgotten, his face pressed to the window in horror. The landing gear just fell off the plane. The mother in 27D pulled her toddler close, crying, not looking out the window because she didn't need to see what happened to understand the screams around her meant something terrible. Across the aisle, other passengers who'd witnessed the separation were shouting, some standing despite the seatbelt sign, the careful order of commercial aviation dissolving into chaos as people processed what they'd seen. Emma sat frozen, her aviation training suddenly providing knowledge she desperately didn't want. She knew what landing gear did, understood that aircraft without landing gear couldn't land normally, recognized that Flight 2847 now faced the kind of emergency that made newspaper headlines and accident investigation reports. Her 68 hours of training hadn't prepared her for this. Student pilot ground school covered engine failures and radio problems and basic emergencies, but catastrophic structural failure of a commercial jet wasn't in the curriculum because it wasn't supposed to happen. In the cockpit, warning alarms flooded the flight deck. Master caution lights illuminated. The primary hydraulic system pressure dropped toward zero as ruptured lines bled fluid into the slipstream where the landing gear had torn away. Backup flight control systems automatically engaged, struggling to compensate for sudden loss of hydraulic pressure. The 767's advanced fly-by-wire systems prevented immediate loss of control, but Harrison and Martinez faced instrument panels screaming that their aircraft was dying. What the hell was that? Martinez's voice was controlled professional panic. Hydraulic system 1 showing zero pressure. Backup system compensating. Flight controls responding but degraded. Harrison's hands moved across switches and controls, executing emergency procedures from memory while his eyes scanned instruments looking for the source of failure. Landing gear indication showing, Christ, we've lost the main gear. Complete separation. How is that even possible? Transatlantic 2847, Boston Tower, we have multiple reports of debris falling from your aircraft. What is your status? The controller's voice carried the careful calm of someone trained to handle emergencies, but recognizing this was unusual even by emergency standards. Harrison keyed his radio, his voice the practiced professional calm that passengers needed to hear. Tower, Transatlantic 2847, we've had catastrophic failure of our main landing gear assembly. Complete structural separation. We're declaring an emergency and need immediate vectors back to Logan. We'll need emergency equipment standing by. The controller's response came quickly. Transatlantic 2847, cleared for immediate return to Boston Logan. Emergency equipment is being alerted. Runway 27 will be cleared for your approach. Can you confirm you have no landing gear whatsoever? That's affirmative, Tower. Complete loss of main landing gear. We'll need to perform belly landing. We're going to need time to coordinate and burn fuel. Harrison's voice remained steady, but his hands betrayed tension as they moved across controls. He keyed the intercom, knowing 341 people needed to hear something that wouldn't cause complete panic while being honest about the severity. Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately. He paused, choosing words carefully. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harrison. We've experienced a mechanical issue with our landing gear and will be returning to Boston Logan. The situation requires our full attention. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions. Flight attendants will brief you on emergency procedures shortly. Mechanical issue. Such bland corporate language for complete structural failure that meant their aircraft couldn't land normally. Emma recognized the euphemism from her training. Pilots were taught to communicate with passengers calmly even during crises, to avoid panic that could make emergencies worse. But she'd seen what happened. There was no mechanical issue to fix, no backup system to deploy. The landing gear was gone, scattered across East Boston, and Flight 2847 would eventually have to slide onto a runway on its belly without wheels. Harrison turned to Martinez, his voice dropping below intercom range. Jennifer, we need to coordinate with maintenance, run through the checklist for belly landing. We've got about 3 hours of fuel, so we have time to set this up properly. Get the senior flight attendant up here, we need to brief the cabin crew on emergency procedures. But as he spoke, Harrison's face suddenly contorted. His left hand clutched his chest, his right hand gripping the yoke as pain exploded through him with intensity that no amount of training could prepare for. 58 years old, 3 decades of airline flying, 11,847 flights completed safely, and massive myocardial infarction struck at precisely the worst moment of his career. Michael. Martinez saw her captain slumping forward, watched his hand slide from the yoke, recognized immediately what was happening. Michael, stay with me. Harrison's consciousness fled within seconds, his body held upright only by his harness, his vast experience suddenly unavailable when his aircraft needed it most. Martinez grabbed the yoke, her training taking over even as her mind screamed at the impossibility. She was now alone managing a wide-body aircraft with 341 people aboard, no landing gear, degraded hydraulic systems, and her captain dying beside her. Transatlantic 2847, Boston Tower, confirm your status? The controller's voice carried new urgency, having heard the cockpit chaos over the open radio channel. Martinez fought to keep her voice steady. Tower, 2847, we have an additional emergency. Captain is incapacitated, medical emergency. I'm taking command. I need immediate medical support standing by when we land. She paused, her hand shaking as she reached for the intercom. And I need any qualified pilots aboard this aircraft identified immediately. She keyed the cabin intercom, and 341 people heard the words that transformed routine emergency into desperate crisis. This is First Officer Martinez. I'm taking command of this aircraft. The captain has suffered a medical emergency. Her voice broke slightly before she forced control back. I need any pilots on this aircraft to identify themselves to the flight attendants immediately. Any airline pilots, military pilots, any qualified pilots. This is extremely urgent. Please identify yourselves now. In seat 27F, Emma Rodriguez felt her world narrow to pinpoint focus. The cabin erupted in fresh panic around her, passengers crying, some screaming, others praying. The businessman in 27E was breathing rapidly, possibly hyperventilating. The mother in 27D rocked her toddler, whispering reassurances she clearly didn't believe. And Emma sat frozen, her Skyhawk Flight Academy jacket suddenly feeling like a costume, her 68 hours of training seeming pathetically inadequate for what she'd just heard. She wasn't a pilot. Not really. She was a student who'd practiced touch and goes in perfect weather, who'd learned basic procedures in forgiving trainers, who'd passed ground school tests but had never faced anything approaching real emergency. The largest aircraft she'd flown was a 4-seat Piper Cherokee. She'd never operated jet engines or hydraulic systems or any of the complex technology that made Boeing 767s function. She'd never landed anything bigger than 2,400 pounds, and Flight 2847 weighed 387,000 pounds fully loaded. But nobody stood up. No airline pilots returning from vacation, no military aviators heading to assignment, no experienced pilots coming forward to help the overwhelmed first officer alone in the cockpit. Sarah Chen, the senior flight attendant, moved through the cabin with controlled urgency, asking passengers directly if anyone had pilot training, getting head shakes and frightened stares but no qualified help. Emma's hand moved to her pocket, feeling the hard plastic of her student pilot certificate. 68.3 hours logged. 23.7 hours solo. Successful completion of ground school. Basic understanding of aviation principles and procedures. It was nothing compared to what this crisis demanded, but it was more than anyone else aboard apparently had. She stood up, her legs shaking, her voice barely audible over the cabin chaos. I have pilot training. Sarah Chen turned sharply, hope and doubt warring on her face as she took in the teenager in the aviation jacket. You're a pilot. Student pilot, Emma forced herself to say clearly. 68 hours total time. I've soloed in single-engine aircraft. I'm not qualified for this, but I'm the only one with any training. Chen's professional training took over, recognizing that inadequate help was better than no help. Come with me now. Emma followed Chen forward through the cabin, aware of 341 pairs of eyes tracking her progress, passengers recognizing that this teenager was apparently the only person aboard with aviation training, their lives potentially depending on a 17-year-old who'd never flown anything that required 2 engines. The businessman in 27E grabbed her arm as she passed. You can do this, he said with desperate certainty. You can save us. Emma wanted to tell him she couldn't, wanted to explain how inadequate her training was, wanted someone qualified to appear and take this impossible responsibility. But she just nodded and kept moving toward the cockpit, toward the reinforced door that separated passengers from pilots, toward the crisis that she had no business trying to help resolve. Chen used her code to unlock the cockpit door, revealing the cramped flight deck that Emma had only seen in textbooks and training videos. Captain Harrison slumped in the left seat, unconscious, his breathing labored and irregular. First Officer Martinez sat in the right seat, her hands moving constantly across controls, her eyes scanning instruments, managing the wounded aircraft alone while dealing with her captain's collapse. Martinez turned as they entered, her face showing relief and disappointment simultaneously. She'd hoped for an airline captain or military pilot, and instead got a teenager in a flight school jacket. You're a pilot. Student pilot, Emma repeated, her voice steadier than she felt. 68 hours total time, 23 solo. Cessna 172 and Piper Cherokee. I've never flown anything like this, but I know basic procedures and systems. Martinez made a decision in milliseconds, inadequate help was infinitely better than trying to manage alone. I need you in the jump seat behind me. Don't touch anything unless I tell you. Right now I just need another pair of eyes on instruments while I coordinate with the tower and try to help Michael. She gestured toward Harrison. Can you monitor airspeed, altitude, and heading? Call out if anything changes significantly. Emma moved to the jump seat, her training taking over despite her terror. The cockpit was overwhelming, dozens of instruments and controls, far more complex than the simple panels in her trainers. But the basic six-pack of primary flight instruments was similar enough to what she knew. Airspeed indicator, attitude indicator, altimeter, turn coordinator, heading indicator, vertical speed indicator. She'd monitored these hundreds of times. 2,300 feet, Emma reported, her voice automatic. Climbing at 800 feet per minute. Airspeed 195 knots. Heading 270. Good, Martinez acknowledged. Keep monitoring. I'm going to try to help Michael while we figure out our approach. She reached for the first aid kit, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared to deal with her captain's medical emergency while simultaneously managing their aircraft crisis. Emma forced herself to focus on instruments, calling out changes as Martinez worked on Harrison, administering oxygen, preparing the automated external defibrillator while also coordinating with Boston Tower on emergency procedures. The first officer was doing 3 jobs simultaneously, flying the aircraft, treating her captain, and planning an emergency landing that neither had ever performed for real. Transatlantic 2847, Boston Tower, we have emergency equipment positioned. Recommend you maintain holding pattern while you coordinate procedures. Weather remains clear, winds light and variable. Runway 27 is yours when you're ready. Martinez keyed her radio. Tower, 2847, we need time to prepare. I'm going to need detailed guidance on belly landing procedures for maintenance and emergency operations. Also need medical consultation on my captain's condition. Her voice remained professional despite impossible pressure. Over the next 40 minutes, as Flight 2847 circled Boston at 5,000 feet, a crisis coordination unfolded that involved dozens of people trying to save 341 lives. Transatlantic maintenance specialists in Atlanta consulted engineering manuals on belly landing procedures for 767s, procedures that were theoretical because commercial jets almost never completely lost their landing gear. FAA officials coordinated with Boston Tower on emergency response. Medical consultants advised Martinez on keeping Harrison alive via radio. Foam trucks positioned at Logan, ready to spray fire-suppressing foam on the runway. News helicopters appeared, filming the circling 767, broadcasting the unfolding drama to millions. And in the cockpit, Emma Rodriguez monitored instruments with focus that blocked out her terror, calling out readings, learning the 767 systems through desperate immersion, gradually becoming useful to Martinez as the first officer recognized that this teenager, despite her minimal experience, understood aviation principles and could follow instructions precisely. Emma, Martinez said after the third circuit of their holding pattern, I need to be honest with you. I've practiced go-arounds and rejected takeoffs, but I've never actually performed a belly landing. None of us have, it's not something that happens. I need you to help me think through this. Emma felt unqualified terror surge again. The first officer was asking her for help, acknowledging uncertainty, treating her as a resource rather than just an observer. What do we know about belly landings? She asked, forcing her mind to work through fear. Martinez gestured at the procedures manual open on her lap. We come in at minimum safe speed, nose slightly high to keep engines from striking runway first. We want to touch down on the centerline, keep wings absolutely level because any banking will destroy the aircraft. Once we're down, fuel shut off immediately to prevent fire. Emergency slides will deploy automatically when doors are opened. What about the passengers? Emma asked. Shouldn't they be in brace position? They will be, Martinez confirmed. Flight attendants are briefing them now on emergency procedures. Heads down, arms crossed, feet flat. They're moving everyone away from the rear where the tail might strike. Positioning passengers over the wings where the fuselage is strongest. She paused. Emma, I have to tell you, there's a real chance this doesn't work. Belly landings are survivable, but they're also incredibly dangerous. If we lose directional control, if a wing touches, if the fuselage breaks apart. We'll make it work, Emma interrupted with confidence she didn't feel. You're an experienced first officer. You've landed this aircraft hundreds of times. This is just landing without wheels, same principles, same procedures, just more careful. Martinez smiled slightly, recognizing that the teenager was trying to boost her confidence. Okay. Let's walk through this. I need you to monitor instruments during approach. Call out airspeed and altitude every 5 seconds once we're on final. If you see anything unusual, anything at all, tell me immediately. For the next 30 minutes, they reviewed procedures. Martinez practiced approaches, climbing back to 5,000 feet between attempts, building muscle memory for the final landing that would determine 341 lives. Emma watched instruments, learning the 767's behavior, recognizing how different it was from her small trainers, the inertia of 387,000 pounds, the momentum that couldn't be quickly changed, the careful planning required for every adjustment. Behind the locked cockpit door, flight attendants prepared passengers for emergency landing. Sarah Chen and her team moved through the cabin with professional calm that masked their own terror, demonstrating brace positions, reviewing emergency exit procedures, repositioning passengers for maximum safety. The cabin was eerily quiet now. The panic had burned itself out, replaced by grim determination or resignation. Parents held children. Spouses held each other. Strangers offered comfort across seatbacks. The businessman from 27E helped the young mother with her toddler, making sure the child's seatbelt was secure. Human connection in crisis, everyone recognizing they faced this together. Emma caught herself thinking about her parents, her father who'd dropped her at Logan that morning, her mother who'd worried about her traveling alone, both of them expecting a routine text saying she'd landed safely at Heathrow. Instead they'd probably heard by now, seen the news coverage, knew their daughter was trapped on a doomed aircraft. She wished she could tell them she loved them, wished she'd hugged them longer, wished for impossible things while instruments demanded her attention. Transatlantic 2847, Boston Tower, are you ready for your approach? The controller's voice was gentle, recognizing that the crew needed to make this decision. Martinez looked at Emma, and Emma saw in the first officer's eyes the same terror she felt but also determination that they would do this together. Tower, 2847, we're ready. Please clear the runway and confirm all emergency equipment is positioned. 2847, runway 27 is cleared. All emergency equipment is standing by. Winds are calm, visibility unlimited. We're with you all the way. Martinez took a deep breath. Okay, Emma, this is it. I need you focused on instruments. Call out airspeed and altitude every 5 seconds once we're below 500 feet. If you see anything unexpected, tell me immediately. Don't worry about interrupting me. Your job is to be my extra pair of eyes. I understand, Emma said, her voice steady. I'm ready. Martinez began the descent, reducing power, configuring the aircraft for landing despite the missing landing gear. The 767 descended through 4,000 feet, then 3,000, following the glide slope toward runway 27. Emma watched the instruments with laser focus, calling out readings, her voice automatic despite her racing heart. 1,000 feet, 180 knots. 800 feet, 175 knots. 500 feet, 165 knots. Martinez's hands were steady on the controls, making tiny adjustments, keeping the aircraft perfectly aligned with the runway centerline. Below them, Logan Airport appeared, the long ribbon of runway 27 covered with fire-suppressing foam, emergency vehicles positioned along the sides, hundreds of firefighters and rescue personnel waiting for impact. 300 feet, 160 knots. 200 feet, 155 knots. They dropped below the buildings, the runway rushing up to meet them, the moment of truth seconds away. Emma could see foam on the runway, could see emergency vehicles, could see the ground approaching at impossible speed. 100 feet, 150 knots. 50 feet, 145 knots. Nose is up. Looking good. Martinez flared slightly, raising the nose, bleeding off the last speed. The Boeing 767's fuselage, without landing gear to cushion the impact, struck the foam-covered runway with force that shook the entire aircraft. Metal screamed as the belly scraped concrete at 140 knots, engines tearing away as they contacted the runway, the aircraft sliding down the centerline in a shower of sparks and torn metal and burning friction. Emma was thrown forward against her harness, the world becoming violence and noise and terror that lasted seconds and felt like hours. The 767 slid for what felt like miles, losing speed, staying miraculously level, Martinez's skill keeping the wings from touching that would have cartwheeled them into catastrophic destruction. And then, impossibly, they were stopped. The aircraft sat on the runway, tilted at an angle without landing gear, engines torn away, fuselage scarred and damaged, but fundamentally intact. Alive. They were alive. Fuel shut off. Martinez yelled, her hands moving across controls, shutting down all systems that could spark fire. Emma, help me with Michael. They unbuckled, moving to Harrison who was still unconscious but breathing. Through the cockpit windows, Emma could see emergency vehicles racing toward them, firefighters spraying foam, the massive emergency response that would evacuate 341 people from an aircraft lying on its belly. The cabin door burst open and Sarah Chen appeared. We're evacuating. Slides are deployed. We need to move now. Martinez and Emma supported Harrison between them, moving him toward the cockpit door. Behind them, passengers were already sliding down emergency chutes, the evacuation proceeding with remarkable order considering what they'd just survived. The businessman from 27E helped the mother with her toddler. Students helped elderly passengers. Strangers became helpers, humanity at its best in crisis. Emma followed Martinez down the slide, her legs weak, her mind struggling to process survival. Firefighters grabbed them, pulling them away from the aircraft, directing them toward ambulances and safety. She looked back at the Boeing 767 lying wounded on the runway, nose in the air, belly torn, engine scattered, but intact enough to have protected 341 lives. Later, after the medical checks and the interviews and the initial shock wore off, Emma sat with her parents in a Logan Airport office and tried to explain what had happened. Her father held her so tight she could barely breathe. Her mother kept touching her face as if confirming she was real. The news was already calling her a hero, saying she'd helped land the plane, crediting her student pilot training with saving hundreds of lives. But Emma knew the truth. First Officer Martinez had saved them, her skill and courage making the impossible landing work. The flight attendants had saved them, keeping 341 people calm and organized through impossible crisis. The emergency responders had saved them, positioning equipment and foam that prevented fire. And the Boeing 767's remarkable engineering had saved them, structural integrity holding together despite catastrophic damage. Emma had just watched instruments and called out numbers. She'd just been present when someone needed an extra pair of eyes. She'd been a student pilot with minimal training who happened to be in the right place when crisis demanded any help was better than no help. But as she sat with her parents, as she watched news coverage showing the damaged 767 being examined by investigators, as she thought about 341 people who would go home to their families because a combination of skill and luck and human cooperation had worked impossibly well, Emma felt something shift inside her. She was going to finish her pilot training. She was going to get her private license, then her commercial license, then her airline transport pilot rating. She was going to sit in the left seat of a Boeing someday, not as a student observing but as a qualified captain responsible for hundreds of lives. Because she'd learned in the most terrifying way possible that aviation wasn't about perfection, it was about people working together when everything went wrong, using whatever skills they had, refusing to give up even when odds seemed impossible. Flight 2847 had departed Boston Logan as a routine transatlantic crossing. It had ended as an emergency that should have killed everyone aboard. But 341 people survived because a first officer refused to quit, because flight attendants kept passengers calm, because emergency responders did their jobs brilliantly, and because a 17-year-old student pilot happened to have 68 hours of training when someone desperately needed help. Emma Rodriguez went back to Newton, Massachusetts, back to high school and weekend flight lessons and the routine of teenage life. But she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things, and the training we think is inadequate might be exactly enough when crisis demands we show up and do our best. 6 months later, on a perfect spring morning at Skyhawk Flight Academy, Emma passed her private pilot check ride with the FAA examiner. Her logbook showed 128.7 hours total time. Her instructor hugged her and handed her the certificate that proved she was now, officially, a pilot. As she drove home with the certificate in her pocket, Emma thought about Captain Harrison, who'd recovered from his heart attack and retired from flying. She thought about First Officer Martinez, who'd been promoted to captain and written Emma a letter thanking her for being there. She thought about the businessman from 27E who'd sent her a card telling her she'd saved his life. She thought about all 341 people who'd walked away from Flight 2847 alive. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation took 8 months to complete. The final report determined that a manufacturing defect in the landing gear attachment points, combined with metal fatigue undetected during routine inspections, had caused the catastrophic structural failure. Boeing issued service bulletins requiring enhanced inspections of all 767 landing gear assemblies worldwide. The specific manufacturing facility responsible implemented new quality control procedures. 3 engineers lost their jobs. Regulations changed. The aviation industry learned and adapted, as it always did after accidents revealed weaknesses in systems everyone had assumed were perfect. Emma testified at the NTSB hearing, describing what she'd witnessed and her role in the cockpit. The investigators treated her respectfully, recognizing that her presence, however minimally trained, had allowed Martinez to focus on flying rather than dividing attention between controls and monitoring. The report specifically noted that the availability of a student pilot to assist with instrument monitoring, though unconventional, provided valuable support to the first officer during a crisis requiring complete focus on aircraft control. Transatlantic Airways offered Emma free flights for life. She politely declined, explaining that accepting would feel like profiting from tragedy. Instead, she asked them to establish a scholarship fund for aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds, using the media attention to create something positive from the crisis. The airline agreed, establishing the Flight 2847 Memorial Scholarship, funding flight training for 20 students annually. Emma became the first recipient, her remaining training costs covered completely. First Officer Jennifer Martinez, now Captain Martinez, invited Emma to visit her at Transatlantic's training facility in Atlanta. Emma spent a weekend in the Boeing 767 simulator, Martinez teaching her the system she'd desperately monitored during the emergency, explaining the complexity of jet operations, showing her the difference between flying trainers and commanding commercial aircraft. They walked through the entire Flight 2847 emergency again in the simulator, Martinez demonstrating the decision points, explaining what she'd been thinking during each phase, helping Emma understand the crisis from the captain's perspective. "You know what saved us?" Martinez asked as they sat in the simulator during a break, overlooking the mock cockpit that looked identical to the one they'd shared during the emergency. "It wasn't any one thing. It was everything working together, my training, your willingness to help, the flight attendants keeping passengers calm, the emergency responders at Logan, the aircraft's structural integrity, even the weather being perfect that day. Aviation safety is never one person being a hero. It's dozens of systems and hundreds of people all doing their jobs correctly when everything goes wrong." Emma nodded, understanding more deeply now. "I felt so inadequate in that cockpit. I kept thinking my training wasn't enough." "It wasn't," Martinez said bluntly, then smiled at Emma's shocked expression. And that's okay. Nobody's training is enough for every crisis. We do our best with what we have, we ask for help when we need it, and we trust that the systems will support us. You could have frozen. You could have refused to help. Instead, you showed up and did what you could. That's what made the difference. The media attention gradually faded, as it always does. Flight 2847 became another aviation incident, studied in flight schools and cited in safety seminars, the dramatic story reduced to bullet points in PowerPoint presentations about crisis management and the importance of crew resource management. Emma returned to being a regular teenager who happened to have an extraordinary story, though she noticed people treating her differently, the weight of having survived something that should have killed everyone aboard, the burden of being called a hero for doing something she still felt was inadequate. Her grandmother in London, whom Emma had been traveling to visit when the crisis occurred, came to Boston instead that summer. They spent 2 weeks together, not talking much about Flight 2847 but instead focusing on ordinary things, visiting museums, walking through parks, eating at restaurants, living the normal life that 341 people nearly lost. Her grandmother, who'd survived the London Blitz during World War II, understood something about trauma and survival that Emma was only beginning to grasp. "You'll carry this with you forever," her grandmother said one evening as they watched sunset from Boston Harbor, near the flight path where Flight 2847 had departed that October morning. "Not as a burden, but as knowledge. You know now what most people never learn, that life is fragile, that ordinary moments can become extraordinary without warning, that we're all more capable than we believe when crisis demands our best. Don't waste that knowledge, Emma. Use it to live fully, to pursue what matters, to show up for people who need help even when you feel inadequate." Emma thought about those words often in the months that followed. She continued her flight training with renewed purpose, not because of the media attention or the scholarship or the recognition, but because she'd discovered something about herself in that cockpit. She could function under impossible pressure, she could contribute even when terrified, she could be useful when people needed help. Those qualities would serve her whether she flew planes or pursued any other path. By her 18th birthday, Emma had 200 hours logged and was working toward her instrument rating. She'd been accepted to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University with a full scholarship. The businessman from Seat 27E, whose name was David Chen, had become a family friend, often joining them for dinner and telling anyone who'd listen about the teenage pilot who'd helped save his life. The mother from Seat 27D sent Emma photos every few months of her toddler growing up, each message thanking Emma for making it possible. And Emma Rodriguez, 17-year-old student pilot who'd become an unlikely hero, looked up at the aircraft crossing overhead and smiled, knowing that someday she'd be up there with them, carrying passengers safely across the sky, and that she'd do it with honor and skill born from the most terrifying day of her life. The investigation concluded. The scholarship fund grew. Captain Harrison recovered and occasionally met Emma for coffee, sharing stories from his decades of flying, offering advice about aviation careers, becoming an unlikely mentor to the student who'd been in his cockpit during his final flight. First Officer, now Captain, Martinez flew regularly, her experience with Flight 2847 making her a sought-after instructor for emergency procedures training, teaching other pilots what she'd learned about staying calm when everything goes wrong. Flight 2847 never flew again. The damaged Boeing 767 was deemed beyond economic repair, its registration cancelled, its parts salvaged for other aircraft. But 341 people went home that day, returned to their families, continued their lives, all because systems worked and people showed up in a combination of training, courage, and luck aligned in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment. The sky was waiting. And Emma was ready, carrying with her the knowledge that heroes aren't people who feel adequate, they're people who show up anyway, who do what they can with what they have, who refuse to quit even when the odds seem impossible. She was going to be a captain someday. And when she sat in that left seat, commanding a wide-body jet with hundreds of lives depending on her decisions, she'd remember the terrifying morning when she was just a student with inadequate training who showed up and helped anyway. Because that's what pilots do. That's what heroes do. They show up.